Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. This is our film preview and analysis of All the President's Men, starring Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. So if you haven't been on one of our film history programs before, what we do is we talk about the film in the terms of its historical context, its plot summary, things to look for while you're watching the film, and then also everyone wants to know, is it accurate or not? And reason being, the more you know about a film, the more you'll see when you watch it. My name is Robert Kelleman. I'll be your host. A little bit about myself. Many years ago, I used to host in-person tours of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. And then when I was living in Washington, D.C., I used to give tours of the Watergate complex and talk about the Watergate break-in and All the President's Men. The film is based on the book by the same name, All the President's Men, written by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And the actors portraying those two journalists, of course, are Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, portraying Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, two real-life reporters from the Washington Post. All right, so let's talk about a quick historical context of the Watergate break-in. So Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968. And one of the challenges that he faced during his administration was what we become known as the Pentagon Papers, where Daniel Ellsberg released a large amount of classified documents of the Pentagon's involvement during the Vietnam War. This story of the Pentagon Papers is covered in more detail in the book by the same name, The Pentagon Papers. And there's also a film that came out several years ago starring Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks called The Post, which centers around the Pentagon Papers story. And it's interesting because The Post film is almost like a prequel to All the President's Men. In fact, it features some of the same people from the Washington Post. And in fact, the last scene of the Post film is the break-in at the Watergate complex. So if you want to learn more about that story, make sure you check out the film Post. Now, after the Pentagon Papers get released, the Nixon administration sets up a group that would become known as the Plumbers, and they were designed to fix the leaks, so to speak, of information that were taking place from the White House and other related organizations. And the two gentlemen that were leading this endeavor were Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy. And eventually, though, their activities transitioned over to assist much more so than just stopping leaks. Their activities transitioned over to helping the Richard Nixon re-election campaign of 1972, which that ends up leading to the break-in at the Watergate complex, which is in Washington, D.C. At the time, it was the section of the building was the Democratic Party's national headquarters. And that's where 5 gentlemen were arrested on June 17th, 1972, after they had broken into that building, which this ends up leading to the whole Watergate scandal, and that ends up leading to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Now, All the President's Men doesn't really dwell too much on the Watergate break-in itself. It actually focuses mostly on the cover-up of the break-in, and then also several other conspiracies and illegal activities that were discovered while they were researching the Watergate situation. And they, of course, being the Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Now, if you want to learn more about the Watergate break-in itself, like, for instance, why were the guys trying to break into the Watergate? What were they hoping to accomplish? How did they get caught? Et cetera, et cetera. We have a whole separate program on that Watergate break-in, and you can find that on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. All right, so let's talk about the film itself now that you're familiar with a little bit of the historical context. The break-in took place on June 17th, 1972. It was a Saturday, early morning, Saturday, June 17th, 1972. And again, this is the Democratic Party headquarters, or it was called the Democratic National Committee. And their offices were on the 6th floor of the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. The burglars at the time they were arrested, and this is their actual photo. This is not from the film. This is the actual burglars themselves. They were described in a police report as 5 middle-aged men wearing business suits and surgical gloves with lock-picking devices, cameras, electronic equipment, fake IDs, and several $1,000s worth of $100 bills in sequential order. And the opening scene of the All the President's Men film has to do with the burglars getting caught. So the film itself doesn't really focus or dwell all that much on the burglary itself, but it does introduce it during the opening segments of the film. There's also a interesting character in the early part of the film. There's this guy on a walkie-talkie, and that's actually a real life person. So when you see the All the President's Men film, for the most part, it's very accurate. So if you see something that really seems outlandish or impossible and think that, oh, that must be like a Hollywood made up thing, chances are it isn't, because this is such an incredible story. And the film was made for the most part pretty accurately. That most of the things you're going to see in the film actually did take place. The gentleman who's on the walkie-talkie is actually was a real life person named Baldwin, and he was the lookout for the burglars, and he was positioned at the Howard Johnson's Hotel across the street. Now, some people think that the Watergate burglars got caught by Forrest Gump, but that's not true. It actually was not Forrest Gump that caught the Watergate burglars. It was actually this gentleman, Frank Wills. He was a security guard, and he's really the unsung hero of the whole Watergate story. He's the gentleman who discovered the burglary taking place, called the police, and then the rest of the dominoes fell from there. Interestingly enough, in the film, he actually portrays himself. So when you see the security guard in opening segments of the film, that's actually Mr. Frank Wills himself, the gentleman who uncovered the burglary. And how he uncovered it was he saw these doors had been taped. He ends up removing the tape while he's out on making his security rounds one night. And then the tape mysteriously reappears, thinking that something illegal might be taking place. He ends up contacting the police. And in the film, they show 3 undercover police officers on their way to the Watergate complex. They end up searching the floors of the building, and then they end up encountering the burglars. And then after that sequence of scenes in the film, it really transitions off to Bernstein and Woodward tracking down this story, diving into it, researching all the different things that take place, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of great acting performances in the film. So like, for instance, Jack Warden plays Rosenfeld. He was the Washington Post Metro desk editor. And Bernstein and Woodward, at that point in time in their careers in real life, were actually new to their profession to a certain degree. They weren't, say, experienced reporters. And so the Jack Warden character kind of is mentoring them along the process of the film, kind of make sure you're getting them pointed in the right direction. So a great acting performance by him. Now, there's quite a few people that play important roles in the Watergate film that you don't actually see in the movie itself, although their presence is felt on a regular basis. So for instance, the 2 leaders of the plumbers in real life were Howard Hunt, who was at the time working at the White House, and he was formerly with the CIA, and Gordon Liddy, who was at that time of the break-in working for the Nixon re-election campaign, and he previously had worked for the FBI. So you don't see these 2 gentlemen actually appear in the film. However, you hear their names mentioned frequently. So just so you know who they are, when they're talking about Hunt and or Liddy, they were the 2 gentlemen that were leading the quote unquote plumbers. Now, if you want to learn more about Hunt and Liddy, both of them actually wrote really excellent autobiographies. Howard Hunt's book is called American Spy, and Gordon Liddy's book is called Will. So if you want to learn more about 2 interesting, fascinating individuals and get their firsthand accounts of the Watergate break-in, you can check out the books that they wrote. Now, another person who plays a prominent role in the film, but you don't actually see, is well, not Elvis, but Richard Nixon. So Nixon's name is mentioned over and over again during the film, but there's not, like, say, an actor actually portraying him, because again, the film focuses on the investigative side of the story, and in particular Woodward and Bernstein. Now, if you want to read some more about the Watergate break-in, a great book to read is Richard Nixon's memoirs, which is called RN, the Memoirs or Autobiography of Richard Nixon. I've read this book myself. It's very well done. Richard Nixon, very brilliant, yet complex, yet controversial figure in American history. And then there's several other key players that are prominent in the Watergate story, but they're also not portrayed in the film by actors. So for instance, Charles Colson, he was Richard Nixon's special counsel. H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff. John Ehrlichman was Nixon's chief advisor, and John Mitchell was Nixon's attorney general. So you don't actually see these characters in the film, but you do hear their names mentioned on a regular basis. If you're not familiar with the players of the Nixon administration, it almost might be helpful to kind of like pull up the list of who's who, just so you can kind of keep track of all these different individuals, because that's one of the challenges of the film, because the story of Watergate is so complex and involves so many people. There's all these different characters coming in and out of the film, and then all these additional peoples being named. And so it can be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with the ins and outs of that. But as I mentioned, the film really focuses on Carl Bernstein, played by Dustin Hoffman, and Bob Woodward, played by Robert Redford. And throughout the film, they're going different investigative journalism endeavors and talking to witnesses and trying to find facts. There's this funny scene where Redford has with an attorney in a courthouse. And again, you might think, oh, that's kind of too unbelievable to actually really taken place. But no, it actually documented in the film pretty much the way it went down. So you can be on the lookout for that conversation. This is the famous scene where Robert Redford asks the gentleman who he is, and he says he's not there. The Dustin Hoffman character also going off and interviewing all these different witnesses. Sometimes they would go, Woodward and Bernstein would go interview people together, and then sometimes they would split up and go do it individually, kind of a case-by-case basis thing. There's a lot of great acting performances throughout the film. So for instance, Martin Balsam, he plays Howard Simmons, who was one of the editors of the Washington Post. Martin Dardis is played very well by Ned Beatty. And kind of the main theme of the film, or one of the main themes, is the follow the money kind of strategy that the reporters took place. So after the Watergate break-in, it's uncovered that there's all kinds of illegal activity taking place, much of it involving money. And so Woodward and Bernstein are directed to, quote unquote, follow the money. In particular, follow this trail of secret cash fund that has been set up and it's being distributed to different individuals. And so throughout the film, they do end up meeting a number of different people that played prominent roles in the Watergate investigation in real life. So for instance, there's a scene where they're interviewing this woman, the bookkeeper, and that's actually a real person. So in real life, the bookkeeper's name was Judy Hoback. That's her on the left. And then in the right, in the film, she's played by Jane Alexander. And so Woodward and Bernstein are meeting all these individuals. They're trying to get information out of them. Some of them are helpful, some are not, some kind of in the middle. Another real life person that plays a prominent role in the film is Treasurer Hugh Sloan, played by Stephen Collins. And again, Woodward and Bernstein are trying to track down the flow of money from the secret cash fund that's was set up to kind of subsidize all these illegal operations. So the fact that they were able to get cooperation from not only the bookkeeper, but also the treasurer was very important, because they had knowledge of the financial dealings of the Nixon re-election campaign. And another interesting character in the film is played by Robert Walden, and that was the real life Watergate operative Donald Segretti. And so as you're watching the film, you probably will recognize several of the actors and actresses, even if you don't know or remember their names, just because the number of these individuals have been in many other television shows and films throughout their career. And another interesting aspect of the film that may seem too unbelievable to actually be true is in fact true. And that's Bob Woodward or Robert Redford's interaction with the character known as Deep Throat. So in the movie and in real life, when Bob Woodward or Robert Redford wanted to talk to the Deep Throat character, he would put a red flag in a flower pot on the balcony of his apartment. And this actually really took place. Woodward's apartment, if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., was in DuPont Circle. And sometimes if you go on a tour, like say of DuPont Circle, they'll point out the building. And then in the film, Woodward ends up meeting the Deep Throat character in this dark underground parking garage late at night. And that's kind of one of the more dramatic scenes, is whenever Woodward is having these meetings. And again, this actually happened in real life. And so, of course, they had to include it in the film. And it's essentially the way it's portrayed in the movie. The character that Woodward is meeting is nicknamed Deep Throat, and he's played exceptionally well in the movie by Hal Holbrook, this very shadowy figure who is involved in the government and somehow has a lot of knowledge about the Watergate break-in. And this was a source that Bob Woodward had met years earlier. And he's really instrumental in helping the investigation because he kind of makes sure that they're going in the right direction. He doesn't divulge oftentimes a whole lot of information, but he kind of helps say connect the dots or make sure they're going in the right direction. And for the longest time, there was a big mystery of who exactly Deep Throat was, because Bob Woodward, did not reveal who his source was. And so for years and years and years, there was always all these rumors and theories of who exactly is or was Deep Throat. And then come to find out a few years ago, it was released that Deep Throat was actually Mark Felt, who was the #2 guy at the FBI. He was the FBI associate director. So the reason he had so much knowledge of the Watergate break-in is because the FBI actually had their own investigation going on. And so he ends up helping Woodward, and thus the Washington Post story, with the investigation. He was actually talking to some other reporters at the same time as well. But it was really kind of funny when it was finally revealed that it was he who was the Deep Throat character, because again, for years and years after the book and film came out, there were all these different theories of who this person might be. And so interesting that it was finally revealed to be Mark Felt. And now the parking garage where Woodward and Felt met is actually in Rosslyn, Virginia. So if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., the parking garage is there, and you can go visit it. It's not really like a official tourist site per se, and there's not really much to see. It just looks like any other parking garage. But that being said, outside of it, there's a historical marker. You can see Watergate investigation. Mark Felt, second in command at the FBI, met Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward here in the parking garage to discuss the Watergate scandal, et cetera, et cetera. And what was the impact that Deep Throat had on the Watergate investigation? Well, Woodward would later say, quote, "The source known as Deep Throat provided a kind of roadmap through the scandal. His one consistent message was that the Watergate burglary was just the tip of the iceberg." And so that's really important to understand. You might pick that up in the film, but you might also not. There was the Watergate break-in, which in itself was a bad event to take place. But what was even worse was the cover-up of the break-in, and then also all the other illegal activities that were taking place that were discovered once they started researching the Watergate break-in and the cover-up. Another great acting performance in the film is by Jason Robards. He plays Ben Bradley, who at that particular time was the Washington Post executive editor. Robards actually won an Academy Award for his performance. He won in the Best Supporting Actor category. It was one of 4 Academy Awards that All the President's Men watch. And if you end up going to see the film The Post, you can kind of compare and contrast Robards' performance as Ben Bradley with that of Tom Hanks. And one of the kind of takeaways from the film, things to kind of be on the lookout for, is the decision-making process that Bradley has to go through. This particular story, the Watergate break-in and the potential connection it had to both the White House and the Nixon re-election campaign, was extremely controversial. It was not a very clear-cut story early on. And Bradley has these two pretty inexperienced reporters working on this very important story, and he has to decide whether or not they should continue devoting time and resources and efforts and money, etc., to investigate this story or not. So he does decide to do so, and then eventually it's revealed that they were onto something much, much bigger. But again, interesting performance by Ben Bradley, is portrayed by Jason Robards. Another interesting aspect of the film that many people comment on is kind of to see the behind the scenes working of a newspaper like the Washington Post. They recreated the newsroom on a set very accurately, down to a lot of minute details. So it's interesting to see the ins and outs of that. And then several years ago, I used to host a tour of the Watergate complex by this organization that had a journalism symposium every summer. So what they would do is they would bring in students from all over the country to attend this journalism symposium in Washington, D.C. And they'd have them watch the movie, All the President's Men. And then we would go on a tour and I would show them all the different sites related to it. And what I thought was fascinating is the guy that ran the program, he was really using the film and the tour to kind of teach these journalism students skills that they would need to be successful in their careers or future careers. And so 3 takeaways he had from this whole All the President's Men kind of story, so to speak, for the students was, number 1, the importance of working hard. Number 2, because you see that over and over in the film again, the hard work of Woodward and Bernstein, and then also 2, the importance of networking. So sources play a really big role in the film, both on part of Bernstein and Woodward. Woodward gets more credit because he knew the deep source or deep throat source. But that being said, Bernstein also had a number of contacts and connections. Like, for instance, it's kind of, they go through it pretty quickly, but Bernstein uses his connections to actually get a list of all the people that are working for the Nixon re-election campaign. Now, imagine how difficult that would be to get your hands on something like that in the age before the internet. But that played a really important role because they could essentially go down the list and start tracking down these people and see if they could take them. And then also, too, another big takeaway for the journalism symposium director was for the students to appreciate the importance of perseverance. So I thought it was really fascinating that this organization was using this film to kind of teach students about the journalism profession. Now, eventually, the Watergate story expands. The Washington Post gets a lot of credit for the Watergate story being made public, which it does deserve. There were a number of other organizations that were investigating this, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the FBI, et cetera, et cetera. But eventually, during the movie, things kind of come to a head, and Richard Nixon ends up resigning. And that took place on August 9th, 1974. It was actually 26 months after the break-in. Remember, the break-in took place on June 17th, 1972. Richard Nixon's resignation took place on August 9th, 1974. And then the movie kind of ends with that. Now, if you're familiar with the Watergate story, you might think, well, gee, they kind of skipped over a lot of stuff. Why is that? Well, there's a good reason, because when the book was initially published in June of 1974, Richard Nixon had not resigned yet. In fact, a lot of the stuff that came out about Watergate came out after the book went to print. And so they skipped over quite a few things in the book just because they wanted to get it out. And the story was still playing out. And so when they make the film in April of 1976, Richard Nixon had already resigned. A lot of this information about the Watergate was already public. But that being said, the film held true to the book. And so that's why, if you're familiar with some things that are important to the story of Watergate, but they're not in the film and you're wondering why, That's the reason being. So let's talk about some of these other things. So for instance, kind of some of the local court activities and the congressional investigations, all that hadn't fully played out when the book was first printed. And then, of course, the same things holds true with the films they was at. The testimony of John Dean and the knowledge of the Nixon secret recording system. Again, all that hadn't come out by the time the book was published. And so it didn't end up making it into the movie either. And then, of course, Nixon was doing some political maneuvering to try and stay in office. But eventually, through various endeavors and events, is forced to finally resign from office to avoid being impeached. And then Nixon finally again resigns on Friday, August 9th. And then he departs the White House and gives his famous victory sign before boarding a helicopter that would take him back home to California. And then Gerald Ford takes over. So again, this stuff is not included in the book or the film because of the timing of the dates. Now, if you want to learn more about the Watergate break-in or the subsequent investigation or some of the other players that were involved, 3 other films you might want to check out. The first one is Mark Felt, starring Liam Neeson as the Deep Throat character. So by the time this movie came out, it had already been revealed that Mark Felt was the Deep Throat character. And so this particular film focuses on his role with the Watergate story. And then, of course, Oliver Stone's Nixon film is probably the most well-known film about Richard Nixon, and a fair amount of the film has to deal with the Watergate scandal. And then it's also a little bit of a topic in the film Frost and Nixon, which was when the journalist David Frost interviewed Richard Nixon, and a few of the sections of the interview had to do with the Watergate. And of course, they ended up making it into the film. So you can check those out. Let's see, if you want to learn more about presidential history and you happen to be in the Dallas, Texas area, you can come visit our in-person programs we do. So for instance, periodically, not every weekend, but every once in a while, maybe a couple times a year, we give tours of the George W. Bush Presidential Museum and 9/11 Memorial. That's in Dallas, Texas. You can come check that out. Another program that we offer on a regular basis is tours of the John F. Kennedy assassination and the JFK Memorial, which is also in Dallas, Texas. And if you are ever in Dallas, Texas and want to come join us for these in-person programs, you can find out more about them on our Dallas, Texas History and Culture group pages, which can be found on Eventbrite, Meetup, Facebook, and YouTube. If you liked this film preview and analysis, this is actually the second one that we've done. The first one we did just a few days ago was on the epic film Gettysburg, starring Tom Berenger, Jeff Daniels, and Martin Sheen. And of course, kind of a similar format. For that one, talked about the historical context of the film, the plot summary, things to look for, its accuracy, etc. And you can find that on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. And there's actually a number of history programs on there, over 200 at the last count. So if you want to learn more about the history and culture, not only of Washington, D.C., but of also the United States and the world, you can check out our YouTube channel. And then, as I mentioned, if you want to learn more about the actual break-in, not just the film, but the overall break-in, who were the burglars, why were they trying to break in, what were they hoping to accomplish, how did they get caught, kind of all that stuff, you can check out our Watergate break-in program. It's also on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. But that's a wrap for one of my all-time favorite films, All the President's Men, starring Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford as the real-life Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. Thanks so much for joining us. That's the end of our program, and hope to see you again next time. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.